Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In England, we call the slot straight after lunch the graveyard slot, because that is where people tend to sleep like the dead. But I hope that you will stay awake at least for the next 20 minutes, because I think the topic that Lift and Fink have put together is incredibly important. The idea of work, the relationship with the digital, and we've heard a lot this morning about how work is globalized, it's becoming fragmented, it's becoming more unequal, it's affecting labor markets. We've heard about the digital precariat from a number of perspectives, economic and anthropological. And all of this adds up to something that I'm very interested in, is what happens to all these buildings, all these spaces, all these interiors that government departments, large corporations, small companies, everyday people are still traveling to this place of work. And so what are tomorrow's networked offices going to be like? Just a little bit of background. Johan introduced my work at the Royal College of Art. We're one of the oldest design schools in the world. We just had our 175th birthday. We were founded as the Government School of Design because at the time, in the Victorian era, we were very worried about French imports. So what's changed? We're more interested in the future than the past. We have architects, designers, engineers, fine artists, all working together. And within the college, one of our big projects is called the Creative Exchange. This is a 4-year research program with 2 other universities funded by the British government, looking at the impact of the digital on communities. And that's work communities, neighborhood communities. How are these new digital tools and networks, how are they changing the way that we're living and working? And of course, we all know that traditionally we've understood what offices were there for, what the workplace was about. We went there because we needed to access the files, the telephone lines, the data, the people. We needed physical proximity. Indeed, the corporation was founded around lowering the transactional costs by getting everybody into a building. But of course, those days are gone, and we're in a digital era of 24/7 instant interactions all around the globe, the atomization of work, and we no longer have a clear understanding in our head of what we might do with physical space. And this relationship between the physical and the virtual, between the conventional 1,000-year-old protocols of work and the rise of digital working, this really is a dilemma for us all, and I hope to kind of probe this in my talk. I think to know about the future, you have to kind of understand the past. And so I want to treat you to a rapid fire, in just a few minutes, a kind of lightning tour of the workplace. I think if you look at the modern workplace, you're really thinking about 3 great waves of change. The first wave of change was what we would call the Taylorist office. And this was after Frederick Taylor, stern, puritanical American engineer, lived from 1856 to 1915. He invented time and motion, scientific management. And what he encountered was the leisurely world of the late 19th century clerk. And you can see it in this photograph. They're all men, they're masters of their own domain. They have a roll-top desk, they can organize the contents however they like. They have high-back chairs, so they're not supervised. And within a few short years, the efficiency mantra of Frederick Taylor got rid of all of that. The workers are mainly women, and they are being supervised. You can see the supervisor against the post in the middle of the photograph. And they are doing repetitive, rote work because they have invented a mechanization, and this is the efficiency of the modern office age. This is Fordism after Henry Ford, and the great temple of scientific management. This is the Larkin Building, 1904, and it was built by Frank Lloyd Wright, the great architect. It was situated in upstate New York near a railroad. People commuted to this building. And inside, there was a giant atrium which signified the unity of the organization and its power over the individual. And on the walls, they wrote intelligence, enthusiasm, control. And it was all about control. So what you have is a dovetailing of two ideas. The idea of management efficiency with rational modern design built to last. And it's incredible how, this is from Picture Post, by the 1950s, time and motion was very much enshrined. People were treated as units of production. Every movement of their body could be worked into a mechanized production system. And this was in the Picture Post, famous American publication, extolling the virtues of time and motion within the economic production system of America. And of course, we've heard about movies this morning. Of course, this was very, very quickly satirized. This is Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, 1936, in which Chaplin pokes fun at our mechanized modern society. And it's interesting, if you've seen that film, I couldn't resist telling you that the opening scenes of Modern Times show a remarkable similarity to a French film. This is René Clair's comedy À nous la liberté, 1931, which is about a tale of two escaped convicts who get out of prison, and one becomes a poor vagabond and the other becomes a rich industrialist. It's the story of their lives and the randomness of modern working society. It's an incredible film, so do check it out. And I couldn't resist showing this one, which is Jacques Tati's Playtime, 1960, where he wanders into this Kafkaesque organization in which every room is a storage box. And I've shown this to management audiences, and they've said, oh, we recognize that organization. We've worked there. So this is the Taylorist office, and I'm sure you all recognize it. It's about command and control. And it still endures, but while it endures, there's been a second wave, and this is what I would call the social democratic office. This began to operate in the late 40s, early 50s, and 1960s. Post-war era, light and bright and paternalistic, and it was a reaction to fascism and the end of the Second World War. And what it was about was understanding the office as a social network, as a social landscape. It was about human factors. It was about relationships between people. And it was based on very strong white-collar trade unions in Northern Europe, especially Germany and Scandinavia. And it was about attracting people from the factories into white-collar work, not by paying more salary, but by having nicer conditions. And you may have heard about Bürolandschaft in the mid-1950s in Germany, literally office landscaping. The idea that you would not have a rectilinear grid, but you would organically organize people according to their network, according to people that they spoke to. By the 1970s in Holland, this is 1973, Central Bahia, Herman Hertzberger insurance office, where they created these complete work communities where Dutch workers could bring their plants in, they could bring their dogs in, they could paint their spaces however they wanted. This was rational modernism with a human face. It was also about trying to create pre-industrial communities. And this idea of, whereas Frederick Taylor looked at the organizational chart, what the social democratic pioneers did was look at the informal underlying social networks that make organizations run. The go-to person, the gossip, the flirting. We all know about how informally work organizations come together. And in recent years, this is the poster boy of the Social Democratic Office. This is by Niels Torp, 1980, with a solar-lit internal street. This is the SAS building just outside Stockholm. And you can see it's as far from a tailorist office as you'll get. And this template has been copied all over the world by the large corporates. There's a kind of seeming paternalism by the owner-occupiers who've put up these glass buildings with their boulevards, their avenues, their town squares, their coffee shops. And I'm sure we've all been in them. And what's interesting is that famous books on town planning, like Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities, a wonderful book which says why Greenwich Village worked and why various American suburbs died. This has been reinvented as an office primer. And in fact, this is Chayat-Day. This is Chayat-Day's office in Los Angeles and a warehouse in Los Angeles creating Central Park from New York and using ship containers to create the stacking in all its detail of a Greenwich Village townhouse. So the Social Democratic Office was different from the Taylorist office, but both of them were dealing with physical space. What makes the third wave of change and the subject of this conference so absolutely fascinating is the networked office. This is the third wave of change. Here, virtual presence coexists with physical presence. There's an emphasis on effectiveness and not just efficiency. The model is less stable and much more geared to the volatility of business change. And it's no longer linear and analog. We have this amazing set of interactions. And it really does ask a question. Once we have the kind of computing power that we're carrying around with us in our pockets and under our arms, what are office buildings for? There was a famous book by the economist Francis Cairncross who talked about the death of distance. Why commute to an office when you can have all the data come to you? But of course, as we know, that the digital is hugely disrupting labor markets and patterns of work. I was recently asked to curate an exhibition in the UK. It was at FACT in Liverpool, and we also did a book published by Liverpool University Press called Time and Motion. And in it, we put across the idea that we were into a new era of digital time and motion, in which you no longer needed to have a supervisor leaning against a pillar watching what you do. The company could just check your online activity, your digital trace. And of course, this is a famous banner, and it was invented by Robert Owen, who was the great British social reformer who campaigned successfully for the 8-hour working day. 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest in 1817. And we know that today, the contemporary information worker, and that includes all of us, we labor in a factory whose gates never close and with work continuously, tantalizingly close at hand. And we've talked this morning about the weakness, the relative weakness of trade unions in a post-spatial workplace. This is part of the problem. So we did this exhibition in Liverpool, and I just thought I'd show you a couple of the exhibits because they relate to kind of the narrative of this conference. And do check out the book, Liverpool University Press. We started the exhibition with a clip of the Lumiere brothers, 1895, showing 100 workers leaving the factory in Lyon by 2 gates. And then the workers were invited to go and watch themselves in a cinema for the first time. This was the business model of cinema in the late 19th century. What's interesting is the relationship between the birth of modern cinema and the birth of the modern office. They are parallel. We had other exhibits. This is This is Blake Fall Conroy's minimum wage machine. This was in the entrance to the museum. Everyone was invited to work for the minimum wage. You cranked the handle and a penny came out every 4.9 seconds. So to get to the American minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, you have to do an awful lot of cranking. And it does show you, the labor you have to put in. This was an Italian video games maker called Molindustria, which was, most games are very directed. You go to the next level, you win, you go to the next level. This is completely pointless. It's about automated work, and you just get nowhere. It's random and subversive. And this one was done by two RCA graduates, Van Barlin and Cohen, and they commissioned a factory in China to make a completely useless product. But the production line, the way they designed the product and the various processes that needed to make the product, they created a dance. And then they videoed the dance and made it into a very successful film. So what they were playing with was notions of production. Instead of the notion of manufacturing production, they ended up with cultural production. It's on Vimeo or YouTube. It's called 45 Watts. And it's really worth seeing. So what were we trying to say with all of these? What critique were we making about the future of office space in terms of how the digital is disrupting work? Well, I think there are a number of key trends that I'd just like to run through. The first one is that we are seeing the return of the thin building. This is the Flatiron Building. You probably recognize it in New York, 1902, the world's most famous thin building. But in the 20th century, office buildings got very fat. There was something called deep space. There were miles of cables. There were server rooms. There was cable management. But we don't need any of that anymore. Everything's gone up in the cloud. And we're getting rid of the very heavy technology infrastructure. And what we're ending up with is much thinner floor plates where we've got light on both sides of the building. But this also chimes with other forms of organizational thinness. The idea of outsourcing, the idea of cutting out swathes of middle management, thinner hierarchies. So we talked about flatness this morning. I think the key issue is not flatness, but thinness. The next key theme is the idea of the social network. A lot of architects are trying to replicate in physical space the unpredicted interventions and serendipitous encounters which knowledge work thrives on online. And they're creating a permeability and an unpredictability in physical space that is reminiscent of the internet itself. So this is Macquarie, designed by Clive Wilkinson. This is the London office with this red Escher-esque staircase. And what's interesting about it is they had to rip up 10 floors of the fabric of the building to create this staircase. But it does look like a computer game where people randomly meet each other on the stairs. This is the Sydney office by the same architect for the same client. And what you've got is meeting rooms cantilevered out over space, seemingly impossibly, in the way that the interior design of games are impossible and characters walk up the walls. And the idea is that the open plan office, and these offices are all open plan, are as open to possibility and distraction as the web itself. But if you take somebody like Susan Cain, who wrote this very successful book called Quiet, she points out that these spaces can actually inhibit creativity as much as encourage it. And I'll quote what she says. "We came to value transparency to knock down walls, not only online but also in person. We failed to realize that what makes sense for the asynchronous, relatively anonymous interactions of the internet might not work as well inside the face-to-face, politically charged, acoustically noisy confines of the open plan office." More positively, a big trend in the digital working era is the growth of learning labs, changing how we generate, capture, and share ideas, often with experts from different parts of the world contributing remotely to the building of knowledge. And these started in academia. This is the D School at Stanford University in California. But there's also a lot of very technology-intensive learning labs within corporate organizations. This one is by Gensler for PricewaterhouseCoopers in the States. And then there's the rise of the co-work cluster. And I want to end with this because my time is nearly out. Co-working has had the most incredible boom. It's to do with the precariat, but the corporates have got in on the act too. Co-working is that co-workers tend to be young, university educated, often associated with the creative and new media industry. They are trying to get away from the standard corporate workplace. Many of them in London are private members clubs, like the Hospital Club. Some of them are public spaces, like this is the IP Centre in the British Library. And there are lots of co-working spaces all over London. The point about co-working spaces is, in a sense, they are pre-corporation. They are going back to the guild where people in medieval times, the silversmiths and the furniture makers and the goldsmiths, they all worked together. They shared a similar outlook and speciality. They're moving away from the corporation, the reduction of transactional costs, by getting lots of specialists who are just employed by the same company to be in the same building. And what's interesting, I just thought I'd show you this. This is Coke. This is the new headquarters for Coca-Cola in London. It's just opened in the last 2 weeks, designed by Morris Smith Architects. And the look of it is very like a co-working space. And the corporates are getting in on the act. And so the whole co-working movement is becoming now quite confused, especially as a lot of corporates are using the co-worker vocabulary to create incubators. So that is a lightning, I hope I've set the ground for this afternoon's presentations, looking at the history and future of office space. I'd like to leave you with this painting, one of my favorite paintings. It's called Office in a Small City, 1951, by Edward Hopper. And you can see how minimal his work desk is. I mean, he could have a mobile phone on there or a tablet. He hasn't. And it's quite interesting that if you think about the next generation of buildings, and this is the new design of the Helsinki digitally enabled public library, organic, recycled timbers, there's a very good chance that the office interiors of the mid-21st century will be exactly the same as the office interiors of the mid-20th century. So think about that. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. So actually, you kind of answered part of the question in your last slide, but one of the things that is striking is that the office in Holland in the 70s, where you can bring your plants, your animals, reminds us a lot of what Google is putting forward these days with their offices. Yeah. So do you think this is more of the old, or are they really inventing something new and proposing something different?
Well, I think one of the most depressing things I find in doing research in workplace design is when I go to a company and they say, you know, we'd like to be like Google. And I say, well, you're a firm of accountants. Google's workplace is right for Google. They've looked at their demographic, although that is now aging, and they've looked at what makes a distinctive kind of workplace for them. But it's not a template for everybody. I know of a number of Google employees in Zurich who no longer want to go down a fireman's slide every time they want to get a coffee. So, you know, there are problems with just taking the visual tics and characteristics of Google and transferring it. I don't think they are doing anything new, quite honestly. I think they've thought carefully about their real estate and their people and their culture, and they've used design as a way to get there. They've done it convincingly. But I think if you go back to Hermann Hertzberger's building, and I visited it again recently, it's now over 40 years old, it's still a fantastic building, and the people who work in it, some people have worked in it for 40 years, they absolutely love it, because it deals with the issue of community and small scale and having some privacy within the very large span of big companies. Big open plan is hugely problematic.
Another question was about the research that my colleague referenced in her introduction. Anchor, connector, gatherer, navigator,
Yeah.
I believe are 4 of the typical office roles
Yeah.
that you have found in your research. Can
Yeah.
you explain to us a little bit about what they mean?
Yeah, we did a big study about 3 years ago of different types of knowledge worker. Everyone assumes that knowledge workers are all the same. And if you come up with some kind of recipe or some kind of system, you will address their needs. And what we did through ethnographic research was identify 4 typologies, and they're very different. You can be a knowledge worker, but you can be 90% at your desk and everything comes to you. Or you can be a knowledge worker and you can be nomadic, you can be out there, mainly, very rarely, if ever, coming into the office. And then there are various points in between. There are connectors and gatherers who are doing different things inside and outside the office building. And we tried to understand that in human terms, but also put some generic frameworks around it. And we've written a few papers about it, which I'm very happy to share.
All right, and maybe to wrap up this talk, I would like to ask you a traditional question.
Yeah.
What would be the 3 takeaways that you would like to give to the audience for this?
Well, Johan, you did tell me in advance, so I've written them down, because at my stage in the game, I can never remember. I think the 3 points I'd like you to take away is the first point is that just because we have a rise in digital working, it doesn't mean there's going to be any less demand for physical office space. Organizations still need physical space. They may use that space in different ways for training and mentoring and anchoring organizations culturally, but it doesn't mean we're all going to be working virtual. The second point is that just because we are getting to grips with navigating the internet, it doesn't mean the language of digital space should be translated into physical space. You know, creating this great whirlwind of serendipitous encounter is not necessarily helpful for people in a knowledge economy who need some escape from noise and distraction. And the third point I want to make, and I think it's probably fairly obvious to this audience from the way I've gone about trying to set up this conversation, is that the digital disruption we're discussing in Marseille today is part of a continuum of change and disruption of work that goes back to the spinning jenny, goes back to steam, it goes back to the electric light and the typewriter and the elevator at the beginning of the 20th century. New technologies have always disrupted work and impacted on labor markets and how commercial organizations and civic administration is put together. It's always been like that. We're just dealing with another wave of change. What's different this time is the pace. That is what's different. You could still, in 1925, even though electric light had been around for 35, 40 years, you could still go into offices in London that were lit by gaslight and candles. You know, you can't go into an office nowadays, even though digital computing is 20 years old, you won't find people on manual typewriters. It's the pace that is the major cause of the disruption, not the fact there's a wave of change.
All right. Please give a big round of applause
Thanks
for
very much.
Professor Jeremy Myerson. Thank you very much.
Thank you.